All right, everybody, welcome back to In Liberty and Health. Hopefully, you were around for last night's episode, and I told you about today's episode, which is going to be a fantastic conversation about reactionary thought, right wing thought, kind of what's going on amongst the more, I don't want to say not the political right wing sphere, but more of like the cultural right writ large. My guest today, he's done a lot of debates and a whole ton of content surrounding like these particular topics. And I've found all his video essays, his writing, and specifically the debates that he's done, appearances on other people's shows, to be just absolutely fascinating. So I'm very excited that he was generous enough to give me some time tonight. So, but before we get into all that, make sure you hit all the links below to figure out what I got going on, where you can find my guest, everything he's got going on. Tiger Fitness through the link below, obviously, to get all the supplements to get you all jacked and tan right back there. Dire need of placing another order. I think I'm all out of protein powder from MTS, and all their flavors are absolutely fantastic. So use code Kyle at checkout for that. Fox and Sons Coffee. And I think with all that out of the way, let's rock and roll right into it. And welcome to the show today, Dave Green. How you doing, man?
Good, thanks. How's it going?
Excellent. Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation today because, as I said in the introduction, all the shows, appearances I've listened to you do, you're very, very well spoken and very, very, you know, knowledgeable on a great many topics. So, why don't you tell my audience today who you are and what you do?
Well, I guess I really came into the public eye doing YouTube back in 2016,
Mhm.
at which case I was kind of known for being a right winger. And then slowly over the course of 2016 to 2017 to 2018, I became sort of known as a popularizer of right wing ideas. Oftentimes people call them reactionary ideas, sort of the pre-conservative right that you see in things like Oswald Spengler or Joseph de Maistre or Thomas Carlyle. Obviously, one of my most popular videos was an overview of Curtis Yarvin's blog, Unqualified Reservations, before he kind of became a household name. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm known for. I do a bit more cultural commentary than I think a lot of other people in the same sphere. I think, R.N. McIntyre is much more focused on sort of the Bertrand de Juvenel power and total state dynamics, where I oftentimes focus on kind of the undulations of culture and how modernity is affecting people and sort of solutions to modernity in the short term. And I think most of my work now is on Substack. That's kind of where I've shifted to very gradually. I still do live streams on YouTube, and occasionally I do a video upload, but most of my new essays, most of my new thought pieces are on Substack in written form.
Okay, how would you describe reactionary thought? Because I've heard this, and I think my understanding of it is incorrect.
Well, I mean, it's not exactly one thing. It's
Mhm.
reactionary thought is just essentially a rejection of the Enlightenment, and there are a variety of different ways people reject the Enlightenment. So, I mean, if I were to come up with kind of like a author that most people talk about when they talk about reactionary ideas, usually people talk about Joseph de Maistre,
Mhm.
one of the original reactionaries against the French Revolution, although by no means the only one, certainly the one that comes to mind most prominently. And it was just basically a rejection of the central premises that the Enlightenment put forward, that essentially these concepts of rights and liberty and equality could sort of be autonomous and pursued independently inside of a secular state. And Joseph de Maistre calls these notions into question, and even as they're getting more popular across the 19th century. And so I think in the 20th century, you definitely see sort of a split again between right-wing authors that are more into esoteric understandings of meaning and esoteric understandings of human social organization, like Julius Evola, or one that I prefer much more, Oswald Spengler, and then people like Bertrand de Jouvenel and James Burnham and Carl Schmitt, who are more in the school of political realism. So, I mean, Carl Schmitt or you could also loop in there Mosca and Prato, the original Italian elitists. These were people who essentially drew into question the Enlightenment idea of how governments operate, and essentially looked at sort of power in more raw terms, really drawing on observations originally made by Machiavelli and trying to step over the period of the Enlightenment where people tried to convince themselves that, revolutions were a product of popular will and governments, had some kind of indelible duty to the people. This is I mean, and some people say it's cynical, in some ways it is, but these people from Burnham to Pareto to Schmidt were really trying to realistically describe how power operated.
Mm-hmm.
And, to do that required discarding a lot of suppositions of the Enlightenment. Now, I might just touched on like 10 to 20 thinkers in that little spiel, but all of that is considered reactionary because all of those schools of thought are essentially discarded, not really touched on by modern conservatives, and certainly not by modern progressives. And so all these threads of thought were kind of discarded really after World War II, and even more so after the 1960s. And then were kind of revived during the crisis of liberalism in the 21st century, which is what we're still living through.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you think the interest in these ideas have kind of come recently because of immigration? Because the way that I'm kind of starting to see this now, I consider myself still somewhat of a libertarian, even though,
Mm,
I have mutual friends of ours that are kind of dragging me out of this, kicking and screaming. Um, I think
yeah.
the presuppositions of liberalism and kind of the idea that everyone should be free to the maximal degree and government should be as small as possible, and if we just give everybody enough freedom, then all the rest of the problems will solve themselves. I think a lot of people seem to be questioning that premise when you look at mass migration in the current context. Do you think that's why people are starting to look more towards reactionary thought and people, more in the distant right sphere, such as yourself and Orrin McIntyre?
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of failures of libertarian ideas. I mean, we could start with the basic ones. If you look at like libertarianism is kind of an anachronism. It's trying to kind of recreate classical liberalism of the 18th and 19th centuries in the 20th century. So, I mean, there's already that problem. But I mean, the problems emerge because the classical liberalism of the 18th century presupposed a certain amount of cultural and moral fixtures that recent immigrants or modern degenerated people do not share. And there's no mechanism for which these moral virtues can be inculcated in a population through liberal means, at least liberal means that we would understand in the present day. So, I mean, it really looks like libertarianism or classical liberal ideas, to the extent that they worked, and there is some evidence that they did work in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. They worked because we had this particular type of culture, this particular moral situation. And the early liberal thinkers are fully aware that this is a prerequisite for the kind of system that they want to install. Then over the course of the 20th century, we convince ourselves that this is somehow some natural desire of humanity to recreate liberty wherever they are, which is almost kind of a Rousseauian theory. It's a ridiculous thing that's completely detached from how humans actually behave. And of course, bringing this to head is immigration. What is the libertarian response to immigration? It's never quite clear, but it's sort of the primary issue of our age, because immigration is essentially, in modern Western countries, what is creating the next generation of people. And the next generation of people are going to have their values formed by not by the native culture of this country, but by the immigrant cultures, and then the education provided to them by the total state. The total state being necessary in a modern multicultural society that does not have a clear moral system that can keep people aligned otherwise.
Wow. Yeah, I've never heard it put in such quite a concise way that the next generation of kids are going to be raised by basically people who weren't already born here. And I always hear people talk about Canada. I was listening to your one of your conversations with Local Distance, and he put forth the laughable notion that Canada is doing a great job at assimilating their
Yeah.
immigrants.
Well, I mean, it depends what you're really talking about.
Yeah.
I'm in Canada right now as we
Mhm.
speak. I mean, I'm in British Columbia, and this place increased its population by, what is it, like 4% in 2 years or some insane amount.
Yeah.
And they're all clustered in these areas. And like, okay, do they assimilate? I mean, this is like a ridiculous question because it's assimilate into what? I mean, they're certainly not developing the culture, like the deep ethnic culture of the original Canadian people who colonized this land. They certainly are, consuming like Nikes and retail electronics and Tim Hortons. I mean, is that what you care about? Is that your identity? Is that what's going to hold society together? Your adherence to the cult of Tim Hortons? I don't think so. So, I mean, you have what you have is the Canadian. And first of all, it's causing a massive crisis in terms of housing, but also alternatively, it's creating this huge cultural disconnect with the identity of the native people here, and an inability to really have a moral society that conceptualizes itself outside of consumerism.
Hmm. One thing that people oftentimes bring up in reference to mass migration is that birth rates are low, so we need to import a bunch of people from the third world. And obviously, people refer to this as the great replacement theory,
Mhm.
which is
No,
understandable.
I mean, it's
Um,
factual. This is literally happening. It's not a theory, right? I
right.
mean, people they like progressives have this weird they call things that are like observably, measurably happening like theories. I mean, like if this was something that was going to happen in
Mhm.
20 years, maybe you could call it a theory. This is something that is currently happening. It is observably happening. You can see it happening in real time. Like London is a majority non-English. I'm sure Vancouver is too. These things have already happened. Yeah, I mean, like the idea that immigrants are going to replace. I mean, first of all, immigration drives low birth rates because one of the drivers of low birth rates is high housing cost.
Mhm.
And so the strange thing is that by making breakneck immigration a thing, they're driving down their native birth rates. Uh, Second of all, I mean, it's not a long-term solution because these immigrants get deracinated and then have low birth rates themselves in turn, and they will start consuming. Like on the other end, I mean, the reason why modern countries are doing this is because they import immigrants in their 20s. They are essentially jumping over the amount of money it would take to educate them and train them for work. But the flip side to that is when these immigrants get older, they're going to become net tax consumers, and so immigration is a kind of debt. It's like printing money. It's not actually creating new people in the world like birth rates do. It's taking people from a different part of the country, uh, essentially consuming their productive years, and then it'll be our children's job to pay for these immigrants when they're on welfare, in addition to perhaps us too. I mean, so this is a completely short-sighted thing. It does not solve the problem of the demographic winter or the collapse in family formation, and in many ways it drives it. It's popular. Immigration is popular by the total state because it stabilizes their power structure, and that's why they push
Mhm.
for it constantly. And it punishes their immediate political rivals. But it is absolutely the most short-sighted thing you could do. It's like drinking seawater.
Mhm. Yeah, and to your point there of basically future generations paying off a lot of these immigrants and some of the debt that they're driving is that also we have a insolvent social security system here. I'm guessing in most Western countries. I don't know about anywhere else other than the US, but it
Mhm.
used to be it was like 16 workers could maintain one person's pension or whatever it was. And then it seems like every generation that number halves. So like right now, I think we're at like 4 to 1. Sooner or later, it's going to be 2 to 1, and it's going to be 1 to 1. And then you have one person working for every one person retired, plus all the immigrants that we flew in here to
Yeah.
take care of all that, which just, to any thinking person, you realize it's a completely unsustainable path as a country and as a society.
And the productivity will go down as well. Yeah, I mean, this
Right.
is part of the mess that we're in. The situation that we've worked ourselves into in the 20th century is completely unsustainable. But I mean, the question is, how do you unravel this debt bomb is a completely different issue. And it also, I mean, when this debt bomb goes off and the government can no longer pay its clients to be loyal to them, that will create a second order issue when it comes to people seizing political power. And that's another reason why immigration is so damaging, because there's going to be a lot of groups that see each other as rivals in a zero-sum power grabbing game, that will happen when the Gibb state collapses, when all these programs become immediately insolvent. In America, I mean, it keeps on changing, but the projection last year was like it would happen in 2034. And I mean, I don't know what will happen. No one knows exactly what will happen, right? But we know the direction it's going to go, and the direction it's going to go is the era of solving these issues of who actually wields power with with an everyone wins, just resource abundance game. That's going to probably come to a close.
Mm. Yeah, it's I used to be a little bit more of the legal immigration is fine kind of argument persuasion, but over time, as I've kind of thought about it more and more, I'm like, okay, so a lot of people here in the US are saying they can't financially afford to have kids, right? A lot of people are off, I think the average age of marriage is like 29 for women and like 31, 32 for men. And people are specifically doing that because once again, the economic situation for them isn't so that they feel like they could do this comfortably. And, as we've kind of danced around, birth rates continue to just plummet and plummet and plummet here in, most Western societies. So why should we continue to welcome people in who are going to cause more issues and throw more gas on this metaphorical fire when the native born population doesn't feel like they can even reproduce themselves? Um, because just their economic situation is so poor.
I mean, your real utility for being in this country is that you have a stake in it. You have a piece of the power that is the United States government. If you replace your population, then that power drains away. I mean, power is a zero-sum game, and if there are groups that see you as rivals to them in this zero-sum game, this creates a huge risk for you and your descendants, and no one's able to kind of deal with this at all. This whole legal immigration thing. I mean, all of the negative consequences of immigration that I've been talking about, include cultural deracination, ethnic balkanization, the destabilization of the state and the culture. If you look at the Putnam effect, the loss of social cohesion at all levels, all of these problems are being driven by legal immigration, not illegal immigration. I mean,
Mhm.
it's being driven by the quantity of immigrants we're bringing in, not the status the government holds over them. And the government could just declare any number of, I mean, if the government had open borders, then all immigrants would be immigrants, would be legal. And then they could invite the entire population of Africa into Arkansas. And, it would be great because it's legal, right? I mean, of course it wouldn't be. This idea that you can legally replace a population. I mean, anything the government does is by definition legal,
Mhm.
right? The question is, do you want the native populations of the West to be replaced, and do you like the societies that emerge from these highly disrupted waves of immigration? And I think the answer to both of these questions is obviously no for almost all people.
Mhm.
It's very profitable for the government, that's for sure.
Yeah, one thing that I also wanted to touch on is that obviously it seems as cultures get more and more diverse, um, there tends to be, like you said, less and less social cohesion, but also less social trust, which I think is kind of a
Mm.
prerequisite if you want to have any kind of society with any kind of amount of liberty, because you can trust people naturally. Well,
Yeah.
as you have less and less, people who look like you in your own society, then, it's just a fact that people have an innate group preference. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is what it is. I'm
No,
married to my
no,
wife.
no common culture, no common sense. Like
Right.
all these conservatives are appealing to like common sense liberty, or like this is
Yeah.
insane. Like how are Hindus supposed to have the same common sense as people who've been developed by a Christian civilization? uh, this is an insane notion. I mean, if you said that, oh, don't worry, all of the immigrants we brought in believe in Islamic liberty and Islamic justice, and you believe in liberty and justice too. Well, yeah, but it's not the same concept. It's not remotely the same thing. And I mean, everyone. I mean, the question is really, how did we ever believe this wasn't the case? That's the unusual thing, right? The unusual thing and the most important thing to understand is not how we're suddenly realizing that different people are different, but how did the West ever come to believe that all peoples were interchangeable to begin with? Which, that's a much longer story, and it has to do with the post-war consensus and all this stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is another conversation that seems to have come up a lot lately is the whole post-war consensus, and I really do
Mm.
think that's, as much as I'm kinda like 50-50 on him, Tucker Carlson, I think, is kinda the guy who seemingly popularized the conversation surrounding this. You think back to when Daryl Cooper was on Tucker Carlson's show, and he mentioned how Winston Churchill was the great villain of World War II. And, obviously it was a little bit tongue in cheek, but people took that very seriously. And I think the reaction tells you how important this is to people.
Yeah, I mean, we have to get through two things kind of separate. What there is the narrative of World War II
Mhm.
about, like, the Marvel movie narrative of World War II, where like the absolutely good allies defeated the demonic and irreconcilably evil Axis. Like, that's the narrative of World War II, and it is a sacred creation narrative of the modern world.
Mhm.
That is related to, but different than, the post-war consensus, which
Sure.
are the set of ideas that come out of the 40s, really being pushed by FDR's State Department. That, like the interchangeability of all peoples, the idea that modern states are propositional in nature and exist to promote democracy always being good. The idea that like secular states were a thing, like a necessary thing. All of these understanding. Also, I think I mentioned the interchangeability of all different
Yeah.
peoples. This is all a package deal. We could call it liberalism. We could call it progressivism. But it's amazing how many of these ideas were absorbed by the conservative movements in subsequent decades. But these ideas came out of World War II and largely based on the Marvel movie narrative of World War II. Were essentially taught everywhere in America and Europe and in most other places that the United States State Department had, its fingers in, which was most other countries in the world, in the World War. And the problem with the post-war consensus is it's radically out of sync with what all other peoples at all other times believed,
Mhm.
and it just puts forward ideas that are frankly untrue. And right now it's just kind of being propped up by this consensus of experts, the inheritors of FDR's government that he built in the 30s and 40s, and it's currently kind of collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions.
Mhm. So, which one of those do you think would be the most detrimental? The interchangeability? Yeah, I know
Well,
it's a loaded
I don't know.
question,
It's
but yeah,
hard. It's I mean,
yeah.
it's which one's most detrimental. I mean,
Mhm.
I don't know. I mean, obviously, if you were talking about like the most immediate problem in Western countries, it is immigration, because as the immigration rate continues to go up, the ability of native populations to establish a new government that represents their interest is going to slowly or very quickly drain away.
Mhm.
Uh, the one that you encounter most in your everyday life are the ideas of like liberty and bodily autonomy and sexual liberty.
Mhm.
Like none of these ideas existed. I mean, there was a concept of liberty that existed before World War II, but this idea that it extended to things like, sleeping with, like going to orgies or whatever, that was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I mean, this is like, depending on where you live, this is a joke. But
Mhm.
in like many urban areas, the whole dating and sexual culture and even the friendship between men and women are destroyed by this misapprehension about human nature. And then if you kind of go to like a civilizational scale, I mean, what really kind of caused this, and I mean, like the really kind of caused this is the removal of religion and faith from the West. That is the source of it. And like we had to be sympathetic to the New Dealers here. This process of deracination began with the Industrial Revolution, and it continued to the late 19th century and World War One, in which most Western countries' elites completely left their faiths, and as such, there needed to be a new understanding of the government and the government's mission, and this was like the best thing that they had in the 40s. Like this was the way forward, and this was their honest attempt to make something that looked like it brought the best of the old world and the best of the new world together. But as what happens in all of these kind of artificial systems is the contradictions end up eating like a cancer. They end up just devouring the living cells. And
Mhm.
what you go back to the communists in the 1930s and 40s that were in the State Department and developed the policy and the vision of what it would mean to be a modern nation in the post-war world. These people were, by our definitions, like very non-degenerate people. They all got married. They all liked classical music. People complained about the Frankfurt School and Adorno, like the
Yeah.
classic guy that came over after World War II and wanted to destroy Western civilization because he wanted communist revolution and because of the Holocaust or whatever. I mean, but Adorno was like this person who thought like jazz was degenerate. He imagined like this kind of like high Western culture, civilization that would replace the consumeristic West, where we would all be reading like Schopenhauer and like
Mhm.
listening to Elgar symphonies or whatever, and and not participating in all the sexual degeneracy. And these are people who imagined sort of this aspirational secular man to kind of come in and fill the place of religion, and it never occurred. And again, if you kind of looked, if you read your Aristotle, if you understood the ancient wisdom of pre-enlightenment, you probably would predict that this project of trying to create a society based on rules as opposed to an understanding of religious virtue would be destined to fail. But
Mhm.
what were they going to do? Like not create a functional world for 60 years to rule the world. It's hard to blame them in some sense, right? But now the system they created is in the process of dying, and we're sitting around here wondering what can be made in its wake.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because it seemed like a lot of these problems had started to really kick off around the sexual revolution, particularly around like the years 19, maybe the mid 60s, early 60s to like 1971, when, we went off the gold standard, hormonal birth control was invented. That seems like things really went for kind of a tailspin from there because it seemed like up until that point, and maybe you can correct me if I'm mistaken here, that like things were relatively well off because I'm sure you've heard all the liberals say that, oh, the black um family legitimacy rate was like increasing faster than the average white person,
Uh,
and
uh,
everything was fine until around the welfare state, right?
well,
Basically,
the black
yeah.
community had gotten a lot of wealth in the
Mhm.
20s and 30s with its. Even there was this great migration from of African American populations from rural areas in the South to urban areas in the Midwest, and sometimes in the Northeast. And this created a huge amount of wealth for the community, and it allowed them to. I mean, this whole like the rate of increase is a bit of a red herring because it's like
Mm.
it was lower than the whites and then it increased faster. So it's like,
Okay.
I have a new religion, do you want to be my convert? Oh wow, I increased my religion by 100%, right? If I'm the fastest growing religion on the planet, like it's the rate of growth. I mean, but there's a core of truth there, and that was that during the era when culture was intact and uh you know um when this community had wealth and they were religious, then they could keep that wealth in their community and it would get used for creating like the Harlem Renaissance and all of these thriving black business districts. Now they were excluded. Their elites were forced essentially to be local actors because their elites could not join the mainstay of white society. But leaving aside like the brain drain that white America did to Black America, which is kind of a second order effect, what really killed all this. I mean, after World War II, sexual degeneracy in the elite classes started happening really quickly, and this was largely due to the invention of birth control, although it had been there since the early 20th century, like the Roaring Twenties and all this stuff. I mean, I say like all these people were communists, were conservatives, and they, by modern day standards, they certainly were, but a few of them on the side were experimenting with the sexual degeneracy stuff. And then after birth control, progesterone based birth control was developed in the 50s, huge swaths of the business elite and the government elite just basically turned their back on Christian sexual norms in a big way. And like, of course, like elite men would always have the ability to maintain mistresses, but now like your ordinary traveling salesman could do that, because if you got a secretary pregnant, she'd be on birth, or if you had unprotected sex, his secretary would be on birth control, right?
Yeah.
Or there would be abortion alternatives that were coming up. So I mean, like, what happened in the sexual revolution is, as predicted by elite theory, and we remember it as taking place in the 60s, even though it started in the 50s. We remember the 60s. I mean, when we talk about the 60s, like the hippies and the student rebellions, that was like 68, 69, right? Why do we remember the 60s as being like this totally disruptive decade when the student protests and the violence only were in the last 2 years and largely took place in the 70s, as a matter of fact? Well, across the 60s, from Kennedy's assassination onward, the bad habits that had been restricted to the elite classes in terms of drugs and the sexual revolution became the purview of middle America. And even before, the riots over Vietnam and all this stuff, the social contract and the moral systems that had kind of kept communities intact were largely done away with. Now, like, if you're rich and you're middle class and you're white, you can, and your daughter has a few affairs in college, maybe gets pregnant, has an abortion, like, she's able to land that and become middle class in the 80s. If you're African American, like, all of these problems, like the social controls go away. There's no like cushion of wealth to bail you out. Like, your family is broken and is unable to sustain a middle class or even a lower middle class lifestyle. And so the second, the norms against promiscuity go away, the second drugs hit the African American community, these communities just start burning themselves to the ground across the 1960s. And the hope was that the civil rights would replace opportunities at the upper level that blacks lost in their own communities due to the fact that the communities destroyed themselves. But I would argue that it really just kind of brain drained these places more than it actually saved them.
One thing that I've always found interesting when you're debating more of the liberal types, your Joel Berry, your Wokel Distance, is that you kind of press on the point of race. And it's not because, like, oh, you're obsessed with race. It's because when you press on that point, you start to make them uncomfortable because it challenges a lot of their presuppositions. And this kind of leads into what I wanted to ask you about. Like, why is it that let's say the Black community back then when they got drugs introduced, which I'm sure white families probably got the same amount of drugs introduced at some certain point. Why do you think it hit them worse than it hit whites?
Because human groups are not interchangeable.
Well, not just
I mean, but
that, yeah.
that is the reason. I mean,
Okay.
okay, they were poor,
Yeah.
right? First of all, as I already mentioned, if you take cocaine,
Yeah.
and you're rich, and you drop out for 2 years, like you go to a rehab program, unless you get really hit back by it, you get a second chance. That happens to you if you're poor. Usually you have to do crime to get the money to get the cocaine to begin with. It's just it's a totally different situation. But I mean, like, another dimension, this is the reason why I bring this up constantly, because the conservative liberals are just, I do not know why. I mean, I do know why they're so invested in denying this, but they just can't. I mean, if we've known for a long time that different ethnic populations behave radically differently. I mean, you could argue till the cows come home about why, but we see this worldwide. Asian populations, East Asian populations have much lower crime rates than Caucasian populations, which have much, much, much lower crime rates than African American populations, or African populations, because you can observe African populations anywhere. There are IQ differences, there are behavioral differences in terms of their adherence to laws. There are also differences in how they react to different chemical substances. Native Americans have this huge proclivity for alcohol addiction. So there's just, you can't expect these populations to behave the same way. And furthermore, I mean, I guess the reason why I bring this up to conservatives is because, we have no reason to believe at base that different populations should behave the same way given the circumstances. Yet, for some reason, liberal conservatives keep on wanting to guarantee like equality of opportunity. What are you talking about? I mean, I want the well-being of the African American community. I think that we should work towards that. But you've had 60 years and nobody, and yeah, it's not just progressives who haven't been able to do this. Nobody has been able to make African Americans behave remotely similarly to Chinese Americans in this country. Like, it just hasn't happened. No one's been able to do it. And other than like weird edge cases, like communities that are built around like franchise sports teams and in specific highly controlled environments like the military, the ability to kind of have a system where, like, okay, you have equal opportunity, therefore you're going to get equal outcomes. That's never been the case, and no one's been able to produce that. So everyone sees that contradiction in conservatives and realizes that they're full of shit. From like they know this it's like the whole founding fathers, right? Like, everyone knows that like our founding fathers were all white supremacists. Like, that's just a fact, right? It's just, I mean, it doesn't mean they're bad people. I mean, that was just a reality of what they were. And then you got these conservatives who come up here and tell me like that Thomas Jefferson was like, believed in the racial politics of Martin Luther King, and America was based on anti-racism. It's just like, this is absolute like ahistorical garbage. And like, so I mean, like, what they do is that they're trying. The progressives have this thing where they try to get conservatives to co-own the lie with them, like a moderate version of the lie. And like a moderate version of racial equality is, we just have to get rid of Jim Crow, and then if we have equality of opportunity, then like we will have equality of outcome. This was never true, but this was the previous iteration of the promise. And so progressives invite conservatives to kind of like co-own this promise so that they can be seen to be ridiculous, or like co-owning the idea that our founders were not racist. I mean, like, racist, it's a fake word, right? Like, the implication of racism, like, again, like, this is a word developed by progressive Christians in the early 20th century. Almost no one used it. You can't find the word racism almost anywhere until like the 40s, in which case communists start using it. and they popularized this word to imply that loyalty to a collective ethnic group is equivalent to what people used to call bigotry, which is like rank hatred to another person because of their ethnic identity. And I don't think that the founders were bigots, but they certainly were racist. They certainly did believe that European peoples were superior, and they certainly were particularly loyal to the European inhabitants of North America. And this is the reason why I bring up race, is that I want to expose conservatives as essentially believing the old hand-me-down ideas that the left doesn't want anymore. The left used this whole olive branch of equality of opportunity. They knew it was fake. And then after the propaganda stops working, they hand it to the conservatives, and the conservatives start taking the previous version of the propaganda. I mean, they try to do this with gay marriage too. Like, oh no, we need to have we need to defend the tradition of gay marriage. Well, I mean, gay marriage is like the previous generation's radicalism. And it's also, gay marriage also does not make any sense. It makes absolute, it's not like people before 1900 or 1800 would have been against gay marriage. The entire idea of it is a ridiculous contradiction. Essentially a man saying he's a woman and then becoming a woman. Yet, so many conservatives are just they're ready to defend gay marriage as an element of conservatism. This process, and it's perfect, right? Because now all of a sudden, conservatism is just about is just a pile of contradictions that makes no sense, even by its own logic, and it is self-consciously just progressivism driving the speed limit.
Yeah, as much as I sometimes cringe at that saying, it really is true, because when you see the territory that marriage can be between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, then now you've officially ceded that, oh no, this isn't a sacred vow between a man and a woman. To
It
touch back,
also allows it also means they can redefine the language at will. I mean, let's look at homosexuality or being gay. How old is that idea? I mean, people, the concept of sodomy or buggery is thousands of years old. That's always existed. But people weren't no one said, I am a gay man in 18. They could have said, I enjoy sodomy. They might actually say that. I think Voltaire did several times, right? There were people who did that and even wrote about it and were unashamed of it, but they were not no, the core of my identity is I am this sexuality, right?
slur,
This is a ridiculous idea. This idea of people being this thing comes from the late 19th century and early 20th century. How old is marriage? It's 10,000 years old. The modern Christian version that is mandatorily monogamous is 2,000 years old, at least. The Romans did it, so even more than 2,000 years old. This is this. So in gay marriage, you have, because we need to ensure equality with this group that we literally created out of thin air 80 years ago, transgenderism, that's a 50-year-old group. We just decided to create this out of thin air, this identity that people could be. Because of this new identity, we are going to completely change the language and the sacramental basis of our religion so that we can accommodate this brand new identity. If an 80-year-old identity can veto a 3,000-year-old institution, then why can't a 50-year-old identity veto a core element of human societies for the last 100,000 years, e.g. man and woman? This move is I mean, I think people kind of underestimated it at the time, but it essentially allowed progressive identity politics can rewrite the language of moral worth, is the precedent of gay marriage. And if you have that tool at your disposal, then you should be able to win every single argument.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely true. And I never, once again, never heard anybody break it down that way, but that's absolutely true, because you really are kind of handing over not just the language, but also the way that people perceive these issues. Because if you would ask me 2-3 years ago, I'm like, yeah, gay marriage, who cares? It's just, gay men, or, men getting married. But I think it's something that we for a long time probably looked at as like the bedrock of civilization, whereas now
Well, yeah.
it's just kind of looked at as like, oh, people just do this thing. And I don't think this is even just specifically to gay people, but like, when it comes to even men and women today, I think a lot of men are opting out of marriage. And I can't even necessarily fault them, because they see this as a vehicle for women to punish them whenever things go wrong.
Yeah. I mean, in marriage, I mean, I don't know how religious you are, but this is literally like a Christian sacrament. It absolutely is the basis of the religion of most Christian countries. It is the foundation of the family, which is the foundation of the state. And essentially saying like, okay, no, marriage isn't about the sacrament. It isn't about families. It isn't about establishing patriarchy. It isn't about establishing a genetic line. It's just about like getting health insurance. It's
Mhm.
just about filing taxes jointly. It's
Yeah.
just about like having these hospital visitation privileges. And the most important thing we can be concerned with about marriage is the fact that it's being extended to like people who engage in like recreational buggery. Like this is a nutso idea, and it sends. I mean, it sends a message. Sounds so conservative. I mean, it demonstrates an attitude that is foundationally unstable in civilization. And of course, like I don't want to make the idea that like we passed gay marriage and that caused our civilization to devalue this sacramental
It
notion
was
of
a
marriage.
symptom.
It was the causality goes in the, I mean, I guess that's one thing that the gay rights activists got right. The causality goes in the opposite direction. The sacramental institution of marriage was undermined across the 20th century.
Mhm.
And then gay marriage was kind of like the death nail, but it was for sure the coup de grace, because at that moment it was impossible to tell anybody that we had a stable concept of marriage that resembled the pre-modern version of marriage or the religious Christian version of marriage in any way, shape, or form. And I always say like the test of Solomon for gay marriage was, did gay people care about gay divorce? And the Christians care about reducing divorce
Mhm.
very much. Did like the gay organizations care about reducing gay divorce? Like, no, of course not, right? but nobody who genuinely cares about marriage does not care about reducing divorce,
Mhm.
because a divorce is the refutation of marriage. Maybe, there's an open debate in Christian circles about whether it can be tolerated in very small numbers, but it is in its existence a catastrophe that needs to be handled.
Yeah, I agree. So what would you say to the argument, and I don't agree with this argument to be clear, but I'm
Mhm.
curious your thoughts, that gay marriage represents more people coming into the more conservative tent?
That's just propaganda. It was never true. I mean, I don't know. Like this is
Sure.
an argument that was put out by Andrew Sullivan most famously in his famous article, "The Conservative Case for Gay Marriage." But this is, I mean, I'm sorry if you believe this, but I mean, like,
Mhm.
your Nigerian crypto girlfriend doesn't actually love you either. This is just a fraud. No gay person ever became conservative by getting married. Okay, maybe this has happened once, but this is not. There was no attempt by the gay community to use gay marriage to make gays more. I just use gays as a noun, but to make people who practice homosexuality less promiscuous.
Mhm.
That there was, I mean, there was no effort on that front. Once they got it, they moved right on to the whole trans issue.
Mhm. Yeah, that's definitely true. So one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was also
Mhm.
kind of like birth rates, and then also with this kind of like how men and women are going about marriage in the West today, because um it's an interesting balance, because it seems like as we get more and more industrial and as we get more and more labor saving devices, so to speak, that people do almost naturally become more left leaning and more progressive over time, and
Mhm.
birth rates tend to collapse because of that. Do you think there's a happy medium here, or do you think this is just something that we're just going to constantly battle all throughout, existence?
I mean, how do you have a happy medium sliding down a hill? I mean, you know,
All right, fair enough.
like, I mean, like these things don't stay the same. I
Yeah.
mean, the look, I mean, like things are always going to degenerate, but I mean, we've tried this. I mean, like, you have, I mean, we're kind of observing, we're running a real life experiment with what a free for all dating environment looks like, with no expectation of commitment or no expectation of marriage. And what it looks like are, women, like 80% of women going for 20% of the men. And, obviously progressives have all sorts of ways to dismiss this reality, like calling everyone who brings this reality up incels. And, I mean, it's funny. I mean, like, I've been bringing this reality up for the last 7 years, and like, I've been married, and people, every time you bring it up, like, oh, you're an incel for noticing this. But this is, and single people will tell you this, and women will complain about not being married, but this absolutely does not work. And that's not even to get into the more degenerate stuff like OnlyFans and the other seedier things that you see online with people just literally selling sex. And the family formation falling apart. I mean, I see this as more binary. I mean, you either have a sacralized understanding of sex as being the tool to create new families, or you don't. And if you don't, you're on your way to the millennial polycule runoff of OnlyFans and Tinder, or Grinder, depending on your persuasion. And if you do, then maybe you can halt the process of degeneration at some point, and preserve your peoples going forward. But the future belongs to people that can make family formation work, and the only people who've been able to make family formation work, at least that we've seen so far, are religious minorities.
I want to give a little pushback, and I want to make sure I understand your territory clear, or your statement there clearly. Do you believe that sex between two married adults is only strictly for procreation?
Well, I mean, no, I mean, it's not. If you read theology of the body, I mean, like you're talking about, like, there are certain cultures that say, like, it's only for procreation. I don't know when anyone's ever enforced that. I mean, like, we kind of go to these trolley problems, like, if you do not conceive of a child, it's immoral. That's kind of, I think, a ridiculous position. Obviously, sex is for bonding within the marital couple, and also for procreation. But that's not, I mean, having recreational sex inside marriage is not the problem. Having sex go on outside, an understanding that marriage is the ultimate end of it, is the problem. That's also why, people will bring this up. People, periodically, progressives try to go back in time and convince themselves that people were always degenerate, and Christian norms were never enforced. And one number they fasten on is, like, premarital sex in the 19th century, and they, believe it or not, there was actually a lot of it. But what they won't tell you is that it was literally premarital. Like most of the premarital sex in the 19th century were people who were engaged and essentially jumping the gun, which is, not coincidentally, why the wedding ring was invented. The diamond wedding ring was essentially a collateral for the woman. So the we can debate until the cows come home about how you manage, like, the rules around keeping marriage more or less, or sex more or less, attached to marriage. And you could come up with some difficult corner cases, some sexual trolley problems, or some some reductio ad absurdums for the theology of the body type ideas, where, like, is it really, like, is the rhythm method really illicit, or something like that? Like, that's a perennial debating point among, like, trad Catholics, is, like, the specifics of how you manage it. For our purposes politically, the real line in the sand is it regulated at all? If the answer is no, or in the process of being no, which is most of our attitudes towards us in the 20th century, then your society is headed towards the Korean level, negative total birth rate.
Yeah, the reason why I asked is because there's a weird sphere, and I think it's probably like a very, very small fraction of the online, right? Where it's basically if you're having sex and it's not specifically for procreation, that's degeneracy, which I don't
Mhm.
agree with. I think you can enjoy sex with your, married partner as much as you want, and I think that's fine. Obviously there's boundaries on what, you probably should and shouldn't do, but it's not, my place to dictate how people have sex. Obviously within the confines of
We
marriage.
could do our own sexual centrism. We could do our own sensible centrism. Like that.
Okay.
That like like gay marriage was the conservative position. I heard that like from Andrew Sullivan.
Yeah.
It's like some phony baloney thing. Like, well, there were gays that wanted to get rid of marriage entirely and illegalize marriage, and then there were like radical conservatives who wanted to keep marriage only for straights, and then there are the sensible centrists who want gay marriage. I mean, like they don't like they don't tell you that the crazy conservatives were all people for all human history, and the radical gays that wanted to illegalize marriage across the West were like 20 guys in San Francisco that, who were all high on meth and could never do it if they wanted to in a million years. Yeah, I'm sure there are some crazy people that are breaking into people's bedrooms trying to stop married couples from having recreational sex.
Mhm.
I'm a pretty right-wing guy, and I have very infrequently come across that idea as a serious ethical contention and not some weird type of right-wing purity spiral that goes on among Catholics trying to flex on each other.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that stuff's absolutely retarded. I've had people tell me, "Oh, you can't in our ideal society, we wouldn't have heavy metal, we wouldn't have this." I'm like, "Oh, guys, you guys are killing me because, like, come on, man."
Well,
Um,
well, there is, there you could steel man these things, like
sure.
for music. I mean, obviously, like I love Led Zeppelin as much as the next person, right?
Mhm,
But the construction of rock and roll into like this kind of cult is it is a form, it is a symptom of the movement of music away from the sacred. And I
mm,
really do love Led Zeppelin. I really do feel like there's meaning there, but I also have to reconcile it with the fact that like it does represent part of that force that is
mm,
that is carrying civilization downwards. And I would not be surprised if future generations walk away from things like that because they don't trust it. A lot of these things that seemed good to us are going to look like poison to people. They're going to look like a Trojan horse to bring in the things that would destroy, human reproduction and all of that stuff.
mm. Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it that way, but, I mean, I guess it kinda, like I kind of walk this line as well because like there's Christian metal, like there's bands off the top of my head that are like very, very devoutly Christian. So where does that kind of fall in here? And obviously my favorite band in the world is Pantera. Anybody that knows me, Pantera is my number one. And that's, I mean, there's some pretty heavy shit in there. So I understand the point, but do you think that there is a point where it's like, all right, maybe we're just being a little too overbearing, or do you think that's necessary?
I think we're going to have to figure out these boundaries for ourselves.
Sure.
The problem here, and the reason why, like, I can tell you, like, I would like to be able to have a culture that could have Led Zeppelin and also sustainable family formation and sustainable
Right.
birth rates. No one's been able to produce that yet.
Mhm.
All of the cultures that currently like have tons of kids, like the Amish and the extreme Mormons and the ultra Orthodox Jews and the radical Muslims, these are the only populations on the planet currently that are well above replacement birth rate. They all heavily regulate these types of entertainment products. So,
Mm.
like, let's try it. Let's try to get a culture together that preserves Led Zeppelin or Pantera and also the family. That has not been invented yet. And while that has not been invented and it's not been established that these things will not capsize your culture, I'm not going to blame anyone for being more conservative and trying to
Of
restrict
course.
their culture to be more conservative in this dimension. Because from the outside, if I were an alien looking at human societies from the inside, I would see all of these kind of cohesive religious communities really being the kids are kind of drawn away from those communities and into a modern culture by these very pristine entertainment products. And and I like them. I like those entertainment products,
Mhm.
but it's a reality that they were part of what kind of dismantled these communities to begin with. Now, in all likelihood, what will happen is someone will kind of find boundaries to keep, rock music or some elements of rock music and folk music in, and still have a more or less cohesive identity and moral system that can preserve the society going forward. I think that's very likely to be developed, but it's gonna feel a lot different, right? It's gonna feel a lot different, and I kind of want to keep people's, it really, what I should say is it's really the libertines' turn to demonstrate that they can hold on to rules rather than the conservatives' turn to explain why
Mhm.
they don't like Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath or Pantera. They have every objective reason not to like those things. If we
Mhm.
like those things, which I do, we need to demonstrate that these are not going to destroy the religion and cultural cohesion of the communities that the young people are a part of.
Mhm. I think this kind of goes back to a comment that I highlighted and I wanted to kind of discuss as well. When it comes to like the differences between groups, Caravaggio here said it's both nature and nurture. The tabula rasa foundational view of liberals makes it impossible for them to address the nature part. And I think that kind of goes to the whole when you mentioned how well Asians do here in America.
Mhm.
I think that's both nature and nurture. But when you learn about Chinese in Asian kind of family structures, they don't have the same problems that we do necessarily here in the West. They have a higher IQ on average. They have tighter family structures. They even have better diets. So that to me kind
Mhm.
of sounds like their overall life structure is better than that of Africans. And I'm not saying that, once again, given all the same situations, that Africans would be the exact same. I don't think they would. But I think that speaks to that. Do you think um, a lot of the problems or some of the problems would go away if some of the other cultures embrace the similar behaviors?
Yeah, like we have this example. First of all, I don't know I don't know anybody who believes differences between groups are 100% nature. Like that's just a
Of
straw man
course.
position.
Yeah.
All progressives, almost all progressives, believe that all differences are 100% nurture, or
Mhm.
100% socially constructed. But
Yes.
um, the converse extreme is a complete straw man. I don't know any serious person who holds that. And with the with the African American community, it's quite easy to see in the early 20th century, post the Great Migration, African Americans had a relatively stable social and family situation, and it was highly regulated. And I mean, the problem is that to get people back into that situation would require a level of intervention and regulation that would be more than anything we've seen from liberal governments in the last 100 years. And you could try to do it like slowly with incentives, like just slowly move people over, like by giving money to married families. And
Mhm.
people have theorized ways that you could kind of nudge people back into this. I mean, I think that would work, but it would require a government that could like keep these nudge regulations in place for a century, while not giving into the temptation just to hand money out as in exchange for votes, like the modern day Democratic Party does. If you nudging people into a situation where they're self-sufficient is much less politically lucrative than nudging people into a situation of dependence, because dependent peoples are more reliable voters. And this is why the Democrat base is so strong and the Republican coalition is so fractious. Uh, it's because of these payouts, this patron client relationship. And like a king could essentially nudge the African American community back into sort of good behaviors, But a patron-client relationship really couldn't, because the patron's position would always be benefited if they could make the population more dependent.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, obviously that poses a big problem as well. And I guess this also goes to the whole civil rights regime and basically the idea of forced integration and um, you know, pre post-war consensus, people were perfectly fine with saying like, oh, in my situation, right? My wife is South German, right? She's 5'8", blue eyes, right?
Mhm.
I'm 5'11", hazel eyes, Polish and Czech, right? We're both
Mhm.
pretty white people, and the reason why, I'm attracted to her is because I saw her and I'm like, oh, she's attractive. She looks somewhat like me. She resembles me. Our kids are going to look like how I want our kids to look. Um, some people would call me a bigot for just saying that. I mean, I'm okay with that. It just is what it is. But, then there's even black people who like just other black people. I'm okay with that. Um, but, the progressive regime basically wants this forced integration amongst people. And like race mixing doesn't seem to be like that big of a deal. Because the vast majority of people do marry within their own race and have kids within their own race. But at the same time, when we're dealing with mass migration, you are seeing the culture and society writ large change. So how does this play out? Because it doesn't seem like anybody really has a stomach to do mass deportations. Trump said he does, but it seems like that's still up in the air.
Well, I mean, mass deportations, sure, that will. I mean, again, like I said before, the big elephant in the room is the legal immigration rate into this country. The illegal dimension is definitely a problem, especially for elections, because let's be honest, we know that these votes are being counted even indirectly, through state representation. So there's an issue there. Uh, I mean, I got, maybe I lost that. So I mean, we don't have a stomach for mass deportations. I mean, how are we going to democratic? I guess there's just a question about whether we can demographically stabilize this country in terms of
Sure.
immigration. I'm
Yeah.
not so sure exactly what that has to do with interracial marriage. I mean,
Well,
I've
no,
said
I'm
many
sorry.
times that.
About making a cohesive culture again.
Oh,
I apologize. Yeah.
no, no, no. I don't think that's no interracial marriage can't possibly do that. I mean,
Well,
that's
no,
what
no, no. I'm sorry.
progressives.
Not just about interracial marriage, but basically like, being that this country isn't, necessarily like you aren't allowed to really have preferences anymore, right? Because basically
Mm,
you're excommunicated for having preferences for your own race.
yeah.
Um,
Well, if you're the wrong
yeah.
race, yes. If uh,
Okay. Yeah. Right.
most people
Yeah.
can, if you are a non-white or non-Gentile race, then you can absolutely voice preferences to marry exclusively
Yeah.
inside your race or religious group. That is
Mhm.
absolutely something that is allowed if you are not a Gentile white. But yeah, white people cannot express that desire.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, I don't think that anyone ever. I mean, I know, like, I don't think anyone ever. I don't. I guess this is like what liberals like have. Like every time I've had a debate with a liberal, they always bring up this like interracial marriage thing. I
Mhm.
guess because they're having fights with kind of people in the middle of a racial purity spiral on X or whatever. But I don't think there's like really a serious discussion here. You know, this is kind of the ironic thing is that interracial pairing is very rare,
Right.
and furthermore, interracial couples tend to have a lot less children.
Mhm.
And so the existence of interracial marriage is actually not, it might kind of slightly shift the boundaries of the groups a little bit, but it's not going to change the main, in at least not in the next 200 years. It's not, unless something really changes, it's not going to change. The bigger changes to the demographic composition are going to come from which groups are actually having children. No,
Mhm.
so I mean, people who are worrying about this, I don't think they have anything to worry about. And conversely, people who are hoping, based on this, like getting rid of the race problem, they're pinning their hopes on false promises. Um, now, I'm a person who believes that you should marry a person who's right for you, and I think that you should be aware of the fact that interracial relationships are oftentimes harder
Mhm.
because they have to deal with cultural and group differences, right? People are not interchangeable, and
Yeah.
neither are their customs. And the other reason why they're more difficult is because various races develop kind of impressions of each other as being like exotic, and the problem is no one ever married an exotic woman in the history of the human race, because you could marry like the woman you think is the most exotic woman you've ever seen. After 5 years of being married to her, she will no longer be exotic to you. And the same thing goes for the kind of like mysterious husband, right? Now,
Mhm.
maybe you can be mysterious by being very powerful and having a very masculine personality, but like the impression that your race will have, will not kick in. So there's this sort of like, there's this sort of effect where oftentimes these kind of like stereotypes of the race lead people into unwise marriages, which is another thing to be, concerned about. But other than that, like, there always have been marriages between different groups of people. It happens. It does not destroy the larger problem of developing cohesive sub-communities,
Mhm.
and, well, I mean, like the bigger problem of just having children to begin with, which is like the real problem of modernity. But it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah. I think the point I was trying to get to there, and I apologize for not
No.
being entirely clear, but it seems like these more radical ends of the spectrum kind of start to develop as progressives tend to put upon, this ideal of egalitarianism upon people, that eventually, small radical silos eventually form off, and that's how you get the 1940s in Germany and stuff like that, where basically you just continually punish one particular group of people who might be a majority of the country, and then eventually those people decide, all right, well, no, fuck you, we're going the complete other direction.
I'm still struggling. What's the question? So I
Okay, I
don't
apologize.
misanswer this
Like,
again.
no, that's okay. I may not be being entirely clear, but like, is there a way to kind of wind back from radicalizing people to this kind of stuff? That's kind of my point. Where basically, like,
Yeah,
it.
well, that's
Go
that's a good question. I mean, how do you the problem is that the 20th century is dying.
Mhm.
And everyone had like the boomer worldview. Like everyone makes fun of this constantly. Like that's 90, like people discourse is kind of dead online. We're not in 2016 or 2017 anymore. But like
Yeah.
one discourse that is constantly online always is like this like boomer versus non-boomer worldview. And there's like a leftist version of it too. But like this idea that like you're always going to be richer than your parents. You
Mhm.
are your individual achievements. This is just about you doing you, and meaning is taking care of you because we live in a highly cohesive society, and it's just there. And collective identity is meaningless, and everyone's an individual, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This whole liberal 20th century understanding of identity is going away.
Mhm.
And so people are going to be reaching for, and that conversely, we've defined everything that is not that as some form of radicalism. If you organize your entire life around the Catholic Church and become a monk, that is radical. If you organize yourself as like this a race obsessed neo-pagan, that is radical. If you become a communist and organize your life around class solidarity, that is radical. But I think increasingly few people are going to be like this. Well, religion's this nice thing for Sundays, but I don't bother about it, and the rest of my life is just dedicated to having consumer products and feeling good about myself because I'm richer than my parents were, and I have all these consumer products around me, and the culture feels like it validates my personal decisions. That's what's going away. And if everything outside of that is radical, then everyone's going to radicalize.
Mm. Okay. One thing you mentioned on a recent live stream was apostasies, and obviously people are en masse coming back, not necessarily back, but moving towards religion. I even consider myself more so in that camp because I've always considered myself agnostic. But obviously, with the soon birth of my daughter and being married for the last couple years, I ponder a lot of questions, and a lot of things that I presuppose that were generally given to me by religion. Do you see any potential issues with this in the form of I don't want to say like the no true Scotsman fallacy, but like I don't know if false prophets would be the right phrase to use, but um I like people coming back to religion in a way that's not genuine, kind of like the whole trad wife trend that happened over the last year, where basically it's just to gain clicks, right? Or like Russell Brand would be the perfect person that epitomizes this, really.
Yeah, I've always been. I remember kind of coming back to Catholicism round about the time that Anne Rice was, and then being burned when she apostatized back to like atheism because she learned that Catholicism had unpopular political opinions. Celebrity conversions are always going to be a suspect, and yeah, I mean that's definitely going to be a thing. We live in a social media age. I don't know if it's gonna stop the trend from going in the direction that it's going to go in.
Mm,
Uh, I don't know how sincere Russell Brand is. I would give it 50-50, which I would consider highly uncharitable if he were an ordinary person, but for a celebrity would be highly charitable in my opinion.
mm,
Uh, but I don't know. We can't just. I think we can't. I don't think we can kind of wait around for our convictions, worried about being mistaken for frauds.
sure.
This is something that kind of, you know, I don't want to bash this group at all, but I was totally unaware of this whole trad wife influencer thing that exploded on Instagram in 2014, but it made people so upset. And it made conservative and right wing women the most upset. And it was bizarre because these women who were obviously faking it were making these other women who were doing the real thing feel bad about themselves
Mhm.
and question their life choices because of it. And I don't know what to say. I mean, like, if you are looking into the black mirror, you are going to see people who are fake and who are creating simulacrums of the real thing. You have to have faith that there is something that is real that you're pursuing in your own identity. Otherwise, in the age of the internet and generative AI, I don't know what to tell you. If saying the fake version of something that you want as being real discredits the real thing, I think it's so over for you in the technological age. I don't know what to say. You have to. I mean, look. I mean, maybe people need more exposure to the people who are real, but I don't know. I mean, maybe there's a danger, I guess, of people just becoming paranoid about everything being fake. But
Mhm.
I think that if you join a real community and meet real friends, then you will definitely encounter the genuine article at some point, even if there are a lot of fakers out there.
Mhm. Yeah. It's pretty much touch grass is the best
I guess.
advice in that
What
situation.
else can you do? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, so I guess we could probably wrap on what does no enemies to the right mean to you?
Well, that was something that Charles Haywood came up
Right.
with. I don't know how relevant it is in 2025, but no enemies to the right is essentially a solidarity against attempts to cancel people.
Mhm.
Um, so what and this is a divide and conquer technique that people will use to counteract radical movements, and it was very much in effect from 2021 to 2023.
Mhm.
Is they would catch people in radical positions and then they would go to people immediately to their left, like slightly more moderate conservatives, slightly more moderate right wingers, and they go, you need to denounce this person. He's a Nazi, he's a fascist, he said a bad word.
Mhm.
And this would trigger, and then once you did do a denouncement, they would take that denouncement and they would try to create this impression of a cascading uh wave of disapproval, not coming from the left, which would carry no moral weight, but coming from the right. And they use it to personally assassinate you. And this is what business owners used to do this with union leaders as well. And so, I mean, and a lot of people, they don't understand this. Like, okay, you have disagreements with Daryl Cooper, and like I do, I think I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I think he's a heretic. I mean, I don't. I know I'm saying this publicly, and as an example of something that I don't typically express publicly, which is kind of contradictory, but I don't expect that phrase of mine to go viral. But like my religious differences with Daryl Cooper, like when the mainstream media comes after him for questioning, the heroic legacy of Winston Churchill, I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, and he's a horrible heretic, let's get him. That's, if you do that, then what will happen is they will go around to every right-wing influencer, and they will find the most distasteful elements of that person's life. They will put them into the public, and they will pick you off one by one by one by one. And that's something that we can do. So I will absolutely try to correct people's factual errors privately. I will actively push back on heresy and debate heresy, or things like paganism. I'll do that publicly or privately in an intellectual, calm fashion, in ways that people can actually learn from. But I'm not going to like hop on at character assassination, even using a disagreement, if that character assassination is being started by a government or a group or a set of political activists that will eventually want to come after me as well. So it's essentially just basic solidarity in that front.
Yeah, I think that's pretty reasonable. I remember in the debate you did with Local Distance, he was trying to hammer it down as in you don't criticize anybody to the right to, and I think anybody would really recognize it as a ridiculous motion or notion that you can't criticize people in your own lane. So
yeah, I mean Charles Haywood, who coined that term, he has criticized many people to his right many times. This is he either does not follow that, or that whole no enemies to the right means you can't criticize the right is not what he actually meant. And as someone who's spoken to him several times on the internet, I can pretty much assure you that he means that you should not hop on cancellation campaigns because of the issue of solidarity.
yeah, that sword will always come for you next.
Yeah.
What do where do you think Donald Trump and then JD Vance kind of play into the right wing sphere now? Because I've never seen Trump, and I don't even think Trump sees himself as like a very right wing guy. But obviously, there's unanimous solidarity behind him.
Well, I mean, the die is sort of cast on Trump. The question is, it's obvious that he took JD Vance, and in particular JD Vance and Elon Musk in particular, and maybe to a lesser extent Trump, were actively watching people on the right who were aware of these reactionary ideas, specifically the reactionary ideas that come from the Italian elite school, Italian elite theory school of politics. And the idea there is you have to completely retire the old government and create a new government that is permanent. And this is what led to sort of the change in the Republican approach from something like a George W. Bush, who just sat around making the deep state who hated him larger and larger, and then tried to correct it via acts of Congress along the edges, to what you see in the modern Trump administration, where he's just taking executive power and trying to hack huge pieces off of the deep state and maybe replace it with his own guys. The problem is, the question is it fast and big enough to actually replace the government? And, no one knows this yet. The deep state is weaker than it ever has been. Doge is definitely, Elon Musk, they're definitely going after what they see as the low-hanging fruit of the enemy's soft power funding apparatus. But, on the other hand, if you look worldwide, and I don't want to sort of step into a rabbit hole, when we're trying to wind the discussion down. If you look worldwide, our allies are not acting like Trump is the new American government. If you notice, like Canada and Europe, or all European countries, they essentially have an alliance with America, but in reality, what they have is they have an alliance with Blue America. Like that is the side of them. They have an alliance with the part of the American government that does not go away. If Trump was actually going to destroy the government of the United States, such that that sort of blue American State Department that FDR created, such that was dead and never coming back, all of the European leaders would be falling over themselves to come up with some new set of alliances that could secure their power base. But from Justin Trudeau to all of the bureaucrats, they are all doubling down on the fact that the Trump administration is going to be temporary. In order to do what Trump is trying to do, he would have to, and this would probably take like Trump's term and 2 J.D. Vance terms. He'd have to replace the deep state and then convince everybody that this is the new American government and it will never go away in your lifetimes. And if you want to be a European government that is in good standing with the United States, you have to follow the ideas, you have to talk and have the values of the people who run the current American government. The bureaucrats, the people who run Canada, they are all they say like they hate America, but all they care about is American opinion. They care about the American opinion of California and New York and the more important than either New York or California, Foggy Bottom. They care about American elite State Department opinion, and all of their actions are there to gratify that perspective. If that changes, if Trump is successful, they will redraw their alliances because they're not about to fight a Cold War against America. And they can't fight a Cold War against America and Russia at the same time. Although, when right-wing Europeans are kind of trying to flex online, they say they are able to. Maybe in the future they can, right? Maybe they restore the greatness of Germany such that they just have tons of young people and tons of energy and innovation. They would be able to be more powerful and energetic than the United States, but not with the Europe that we have in the early 21st century. The Europe of the early 21st century is an incredibly tired thing, and their government is only in place because it has a permanent alliance with the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they could always test the will of the Middle Easterners that all moved over there over the last couple decades and see if they'd be willing to go fight Russia. I think the answer on that is no, though.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, they're learning how multiculturalism actually works, and not what was sold to them by Blue America and their sojourns in like Berkeley and other university towns where everyone has 120 plus IQ. And Europeans aren't liking it, and it looks like Europe is really destabilizing. My hope is that Trump's terms in office will destroy the EU. And then from the ashes of the EU will come a new set of right-wing European governments. And those right-wing governments will trigger a similar type of governmental switch in sort of the next iteration in America. That's obviously, predictions about the future taken with a grain of salt, but that's where I see sort of the hopeful path.
Well, I was going to ask you what makes you hopeful. If you do have anything that you want to add to that, go ahead. If not, go ahead, give your plugs.
What makes me hopeful is that I think people who are of a non-progressive persuasion are starting to wake up to the realities of power. And I think that the left wing hold on youth culture is finally being drained away, at least for, it seems almost entirely for men and certainly for white men. And if those two forces can come together, if conservatives can cure themselves of their conservatism, or at least the 21st, if the people who are in the sway of conservatism can become sort of right-wing progressives that like in tune with the feeling and the energy of young men, and they can organize them and they can educate them and they can put them into positions of power, like young energetic guys being put into positions of power, like go remake Wichita, Kansas, go remake Pittsburgh, like FDR did. They could easily remake America and we could have a sort of mini renaissance. I think, and this is, a deeper issue is also the recovery of Christianity. Another optimistic thing is it appears that in the last 2 years, the decline of religiosity has finally leveled off and is kind of peaking up a little bit, which means that we are ripe for a a regrowth of the core religions of this country. Now, this is just the beginning because the leadership is completely out to lunch. And, we need just people who are utterly dedicated to their faith to step in and take the next steps. But if that can regrow, then there are in that motions the seeds of an either even greater human renewal that could come after, say, a government reset in the United States. And I think that there are increasingly people who are interested in community building. You asked me what I'm known for. I'm also somebody who promotes active community building. Everyone knows that it's easy to get people to be in a community online, social media. It is very much harder to get that online community into real life and doing things together. But we've had a lot of successes with this. We've have organizations like Beowulf and Soldings and the Old Glory Club. We have a meetup society called the Basque Weaving Group, and these things have been very, very successful. And I think that's also a reason to hope for the future. So that's where I see sort of the green shoots in the modern world. And I think that if you have the energy to keep on pushing on those doors, they will eventually lead to fruit, even though what we're experiencing right now is kind of a complete descent into kind of despondency, at least in the political community online.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I'm pretty hopeful as well. As I mentioned, I think before we went live, Red Hawk occasionally comes into my neck of the woods and then perches himself up here, and then him and I have a few drinks and have a good time together. So, Dave, I really enjoyed this conversation today. Let everybody know where they can find you and all your stuff.
Um, sure. So obviously, I'm best known for my YouTube channel, known as the Distributist on YouTube. You'll find like content for the last 10 years there. The place where I do most of my new sort of heavy work is on Substack at Letters from Fiddler's Green, and I still have a podcast slash live stream monologue show that comes out every other week that you can find either on the YouTube channel or on the Substack. And I try to get that out every other week, and then every now and again I host discussions as well. So yeah, that's my contacts, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. All right. Well, we will end her there. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.